Welcome back to your Feel Good Breakfast show, Expresso. We are live right here on S3. As you may know, this year's G20 Leaders Summit is historic, not just because it's being held here in South Africa, but because it brings the world's most powerful economies to our doorstep. The G20 isn't just about policy papers and press conferences. It's about the dynamics between countries that hold global influence. So, who's actually at the table? What does each member bring to the mix? And how do smaller economies like ours fit into this high-stakes arena?
Today we are joined by Dr. Sembile Mbete, Executive Director at Public Affairs Research Institute and one of South Africa's leading voices on international relations and global governance. Hello, gorgeous. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I must say I'm pleasantly surprised by how young you are. Whenever we hear such big titles, you think somebody is really old who's going to come into the space. It's a pleasant surprise.
Thank you so much.
Let's get right into it. Who are the 20 members of the G20? And how is that membership determined?
So first, it's important to have a context about how the G20 was formed. It was formed in 1999, initially as a meeting of finance ministers. Okay. In the wake of the financial crises, the Asian financial crisis in 1997 into 1998. And really it was formed as a platform for developed and developing countries, so the big industrialized countries, but also those that were coming up, that had a big impact on the financial markets. To meet in order to prevent a similar crisis to the one that had hit the world in 1997, but also to look at more broadly holistic economic issues beyond just finance. So that's how it emerges. Yes. And that is what then determined who was invited to the table. Okay. So the member states of the G20 include Argentina. Argentina was included because they were majorly affected by the financial crises of the 1990s. And so they needed a seat in the table because they were one of the countries that was most affected, but also that had like a contagion effect on the rest of South America and their economies. Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, the UK, and of course the US. Spain was not invited initially, which was hugely controversial. They were later then invited as a kind of permanent guest to the G20. The reason why South Africa was included is that it is the biggest it's the most industrialized economy on the continent, and also has the biggest financial system and financial market. So any financial contagion in terms of any crisis that would take place would necessarily impact South Africa and our financial system and our banking system, but would also have a contagion effect on the rest of the continent.
And Dr. Mbete, there's also questions around legitimacy, right? Why certain nations are included while others are not given a seat at the table. How does that work?
Well, as I've said, a huge thing around why certain countries were included and not others was level of industrialization, level of development of their financial system. But of course, it was a controversial thing who was at the table and who was not. There's been lots of academic discussion about why certain people were included and not others. Yes. But what's happened is that there are now certain regional groups that are allowed to come to the G20 and do have membership. So the African Union was included as a member of the G20 in 2023. South Africa had been the representative of Africa on the G20 all of this time. And now the AU is a full member, a regional member, similarly to the EU, to the G20. Doesn't just have guest status, but actually has full membership represented by the AU Commission.
Yes, I think the lovely thing about the G20 being held in South Africa is that we're learning so much about it. Everywhere you go, there's an ad on the streets. Yes. And one thing I do know is that they are permanent members of G20, and then they are guest nations or organizations. What I'm not understanding, though, is what the difference is between those two.
So the guest members of the G20 are they host the G20. There's a whole cycle. So with South Africa hosting this year, we're at the end of a 26-year cycle of G20 meetings. So South Africa's the last one, and then we reset to the first country to host the G20, which is the United States, who hosts next year. What we've also had over the last 4 years is that it's been developing countries, so countries of the global south that have hosted the G20. We had Indonesia in 2022, India 2023, Brazil 2024, and now South Africa 2025, which has placed the issues of the global south onto the agenda. But those countries who are permanent are the ones that host, that are involved in the most number of the meetings that take place, because the G20, I think our G20 this year had nearly 200 meetings that took place. So it expanded from 1999 from just the finance ministers' meetings. You now have heads of states meetings. So those are the summits. That's the summit that's going to take place on the 22nd and 23rd of November. And then you've got all of these other working groups that take place around particular issues. So whether that's communications, trade, health, and then you have as well, you have what they call engagement groups. So the think tanks have a T20, the youth have a youth 20, the women have a women's 20. And so that has all evolved. So there are many meetings that happen over the course of the year. And permanent members of the G20 participate in all of them. And then guests, organizations or guest countries, guest nations will participate in different meetings across the year. There is a permanent set of guests. As I've said, Spain is a permanent guest to the G20, but then other guests are selected by the host nation in any given year because of whatever relations they may have or whatever issues that they consider important.
I mean, earlier on you touched on the level of economic growth here in South Africa and development as well. In the context of the African continent. But how would you say South Africa has positioned itself in the context of the G20, and what's the perception from other G20 members of Mzansi?
So, you know, South Africans, we don't take ourselves seriously, and for good reason. I mean, you know, sometimes living in this country is like being in a movie. But, but I think that we underestimate how much of a role the South African economy plays in the global economy, particularly, as I've said before, in terms of our integration into the global financial system. What you saw in the very early years of the G20, so I've said there was the finance ministers from 1999, and then from the early 2000s, it was the summit, so the leaders, heads of state. But what you saw in the very early years of the G20 was South Africa playing a very important role in the norm setting, the standard setting around particular financial issues. So our finance minister at the time, Trevor Manuel, the governor of the Reserve Bank at the time, who was Tito Mboweni, were very involved in the discussions that led to things that affect us now. So things like FICA. So FICA, that you have to go FICA your documents, it's the bank, you know, all of our RICA things. FICA was a direct response to 9/11 and dealing with terrorist financing. You know, things like RICA, there's all of these standards that then get adopted by countries domestically that are initially first discussed at the G20. And South Africa has been involved actively in a lot of discussions during COVID. So in 2020, South Africa led the charge on behalf of the rest of Africa to have debt relief for highly indebted nations. So remember, all of our economies shut down. A lot of the countries on the continent were heavily indebted to both private sources and also to some of the international banks and to sovereigns and to other countries. And so with very high interest rates, and they couldn't pay those interests because the economies were shut down. And so South Africa fought very hard. Minister Enoch Godongwana was involved in a lot of conversations with the G20 nations to say, please, can we get some debt relief for countries on the continent? And so, yeah, so those are examples of some of the discussions we've been part of historically.
Oh, my word. Big and important conversations. This is going to be such an informative lesson. I'm going to take out a notepad eventually and get some more notes. And to everybody watching this morning, we have so much more lined up for you. We'll come back and have more conversations with Dr. Thembile Mbete, and later kitchen hacks on how to revive stale bread.
Oh, you can make my day.
my Feel Good Breakfast Show. Welcome back to your Feel Good Breakfast Show, everybody. Now that we know who is seated at the G20 table, the question is, what does each country actually bring? From economic weight and political influence to trade leverage and climate commitments, the contributions vary widely.
Now, still with us is global governance expert Dr. Thembile Mbete to help us understand the balance of power, the tensions beneath the surface, and the opportunities that lie ahead for South Africa. Now, you've already been dropping so many gems thus far, but let's really get into it. What are all these different countries actually bringing to the table for the G20?
So the G20 members represent around 75% of global exports. They represent around 85% of the global economic output, so global GDP, and around 80% of the world's population. And so the G20 really is a microcosm of the world, even though it's only 20 nations, 21 now with the AU, well, 21 plus, 20 plus the 50 African countries that are represented by the AU. And so the G20 represents the world in the sense of the amount of people in the world, but also the global economy and the global economic output of the world are represented amongst the countries that are in the G20. The other benefit and the other advantage that the G20 has compared to the international organizations that were formed after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, our whole infrastructure of global governance, of multilateral governance, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the organization that eventually turned into the WTO, all of those were formed after 1945, after the end of the Second World War. And those organizations tend to represent a balance of power that represents what power looked like in 1945. The G20, because it's a much newer organization, a much younger organization, represents more accurately what power looks like now in 2025. And so you've had China play a very big role in the G20 over time, India, Brazil, and other countries that are considered Western countries, so developed countries like Japan, for example, but that haven't had as much of a place, Japan or Germany, that haven't had as much of a place in the traditional post-World War II international organizations. So that's really been an important thing about the G20, that in some ways it is considered to have democratized global governance and allowed many more voices to have an influential seat and influential voice at the table, more so than in the traditional organizations like the UN and the World Bank. And because of that, you have seen the G20's agenda expand over the years. So as I said, it started being mostly concerned with finance, and then you saw it expand into issues of trade, health policy, which has become very important because global health, is a big issue. You've seen it delve into issues of how do we address inequality and poverty, sustainability, environmental factors. So you've seen a lot of the environmental and climate change debates that happen in other forums in the international sphere also spill into the G20 because it's this gathering place for a bunch of countries that otherwise wouldn't be together.
Yeah. And I mean, the state of the world and international relations have completely evolved over time. And in the contemporary space, there are conversations about the G20 being dominated by the big five. In your opinion, how true is that? And what do negotiations look like behind the scenes? Are we really fulfilling the objective of what this G20, meeting is all about?
Well, if you consider that I would assume that the big five is sort of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that's the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China. And what the G20 does is that it actually balances out their power because they're not the most, the power that they have within the UN system is that they've got veto power. They can decide what is discussed, what isn't, what is voted on, what decisions are made in the most important forum of the UN, which is the United Nations Security Council. In the G20, they are one amongst amongst equals.
It's democratic.
It's a far more democratic system. And so what that does allow for is for countries that are not represented in, that aren't amongst the P5, that don't have P5, that don't have a lot of power within the UN, to exercise a lot more influence than they otherwise would. And so that's why countries like South Africa, like Indonesia, have been able to play a very big role in influencing some of the most important decisions of the G20. The other thing is that I've spoken about these like 200 meetings that happen over the course of the year, but a lot of the most important discussions of the G20 happen on the sidelines. Like all of these international gatherings, you know, the coffees that people are having, the meetings that people are able to have, out of the public eye, are actually very influential in the decisions that eventually filter into the G20. They're also very important in terms of the decisions that get made about other things. So 2022 was a watershed year for the G20 because that's the year of the Russia-Ukraine war that started, and, you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what you saw was that there was a lot of negotiations on the sidelines of the G20 in Indonesia about how to deal with that issue. And you keep seeing similar dynamics around important issues. One of the reasons why the G20 in South Africa has been so important in this year of the first year of Donald Trump's second term as US president, tariffs, all of the things that are happening, South Africa becomes now the stage for the discussion, the ventilation of these issues, especially with the US boycotting a lot of the meetings or sending lower level people. You've seen South Africa suddenly become important for a place where other people can gather and discuss.
Dr. Mete, thank you so much for joining us here on your Feel Good Breakfast Show and really just breaking down what we can expect when it comes to the G20 being hosted here in South Africa in November 22nd, right?
Yes, 22nd and 23rd is the Leaders Summit, so it's going to be a very busy time in Joburg.
Incredible. Ladies and gentlemen, I really hope that you walked away with new information right now. We have just hit the top of the hour, 7 a.m. It's time for us to dive into the news headlines. What's happening there in Cape Town?